nevela, and now we're at treifa. So last time we talked about the prohibition of eating a animal from a kosher species, but it was not properly shechted. So now we have, he prohibited us from eating a treifa, a torn animal. And that is his saying, and you must not eat meat that was torn in the field. However, the simple understanding of this verse is, as it is mentioned in the Mechilta, which is Halachic Midrash, and that is, they're saying the verse was speaking according to what is common. It is the place where most animals are found, such that they became torn there. In other words, why is it talking about treifa basada? Why is it a treifa in the field? It's not limiting it to this prohibition to animals that were killed in the field, but rather it's just using that because that is commonly how where that happens. It is a place where animals are found such that they become torn there. However, an explanation of this verse also came from the tradition, Tractate Chulin 68a, and it is like this: meat in the field is torn, and hence you may not eat it. This means to say that once any meat goes out of its boundaries, it becomes torn, like the most consecrated of the consecrated meat when it goes out of the temple courtyard, or the lighter consecrated meat when it goes outside the walls of Jerusalem, or meat from the Passover sacrifice when it goes outside of the eating group, or when an animal embryo extends its arm outside of its mother, as is explained in the 4th chapter of Hulin. All of these types of meat are designated as you must not eat meat that was torn in the field. So that this prohibition, which we call treifa, actually extends to these other circumstances. Sacrificial meat that was taken outside of its acceptable bounds, even though it's brought back to the place where you are allowed to eat it, is no longer permitted. And so too, when an animal puts its arm outside of its mother, it is no longer, if that's the only thing that happened, just an arm went outside its mother, that meat becomes forbidden, and anyone who eats a kazayit from them is lashed by Torah law.
What does it mean, an arm out of his mother? What's that mean?
It means that if you were looking, you would just see a hoof come out, just one hoof, not in a normal manner of birth, but you would just see like one hoof hanging out there. And it's not while it's being born, it's just somehow sticking out. I don't know how likely that is to happen, but that's what it seems to be. One who eats a kazayis from them is lashed by Torah law, and likewise is meat from a living animal designated as torn, and one who eats it is lashed. So again, treifa, this notion of treifa is extended beyond just an animal that, let's say you have a sheep that's killed by a wolf. That would be a classic case of treifa, but now the Rambam is showing how there's all manner of cases that you would not at first expect, but they are all, what they share is something is out of its normal location, and because of that, it is forbidden. One who eats a kazayis from them is lashed by Torah law, and likewise is meat from a living animal designated as torn. So we talk about Aver min achai. Aver min achai is a limb that is from a living animal. It would be the same kind of thing if somebody cut meat from a living animal to eat it. So imagine you live in a time, which was most of human history, when there was not refrigeration. So you had a few options if you wanted to extend meat. In other words, if you wanted to save meat for eating later, one of them is you could salt it. Another one is you could smoke it. And I guess you could dry it. I don't know how they would do that. I guess they could dry it in the sun. So you could salt it, you could smoke it, you could dry it. But so let's say those methods aren't available to you. So apparently, what some would do is they would cut off meat or a limb from an animal, but not kill it, so that while it's alive, it's still able to keep the rest of its meat fresh. So this would be an example of eating meat from a living animal. So Aver Min HaChai is also included.
And that's okay. That's not.
It is forbidden. It's highly forbidden, even to Gentiles.
It sounds terrible.
Yeah, even to Gentiles, it's considered forbidden. And in the Gemara Chulin, they said meat that was torn in the field, that is meat from a living animal. So they're another example. So again, this notion of treifa extends beyond just an animal that was killed in the field by another animal. The prohibition about this and the commandment preceding this were already repeated in Ezekiel regarding the priests alone, for the Torah commanded them to eat the foul sin offering, and that is with nipping. But nipping with ordinary meat is not slaughter, without a doubt, but rather renders it a carcass. What do they mean by nipping? This is malika, which is slaughtering with a sharpened fingernail. So this is done in the Beit HaMikdash when it comes to the birds. The birds are slaughtered using a sharpened fingernail. I mean, while the fingernail's still attached. So it'd be a thumbnail, a sharpened thumbnail, and they had a way of holding the head back, and they would use the thumb to slaughter it from behind, from the neck from behind. That is only permitted for bird offerings. It is not permitted to eat for regular eating of birds. You have to shecht a bird that is just regular meat. But in the Beit HaMikdash, you used what's called malika, which is the slaughtering with the nail. Nipping with ordinary meat is not slaughter, without a doubt, but rather renders it a carcass. It might have crossed our minds that for them, eating from nipping is also permitted with ordinary meat, and the same would be the law for all invalid slaughter. And hence he explained that they remain within the category of Israelites and with the prohibition of eating carcasses and torn animals. So even regular Israelites are forbidden, and this is still considered like what we would call nevela, which is the prohibition of eating the meat from an animal that wasn't properly slaughtered. Could have died on its own, could have died for all manner of reasons, didn't have to necessarily be killed by another animal. And then there's treifa, which the classic case of treifa is that it's killed by another animal, but it could be some of these other cases that we talked about, including eating Aver Min HaChai, the limb from a living animal. That is what the sages mentioned, along with another law, which they testify to us from a verse, but we do not intend to mention it in this essay of ours. However, eating a beast or animal that develops one of the conditions that render it torn, terminally injured or ill, received by tradition, is forbidden, even if it was slaughtered appropriately. So all the previous cases, it died, and now you want to eat it. In this case, the final case here, we're talking about an animal which was properly slaughtered, but upon investigation, it had one of the conditions that we have through oral tradition, which are various conditions that make it a treifa. So, for instance, if it had a perforation of the lung, or perforation in the brain, or in other parts of the body, and certain other conditions, that is considered a treifa. Even if it was alive and you shechted it, it is not kosher. That's why we check the lungs of cows and sheep and goats. We check their lungs. Really, you'd think you'd have to check all the various areas, but the other areas are not as common. Apparently, it is more common for there to be a perforation in the lung. So that is the one organ that we go out of our way to check after the animal is slaughtered. If the animal has a perforation in the lung, it is not kosher. Again, even though it was properly slaughtered, it is not considered kosher. If the animal has scar tissue, so there are those who say that it is not kosher because that scar tissue indicates that it had a perforation. So Sephardic Jews do not eat it, even if there's that kind of scar tissue. Ashkenazic Jews prefer not to eat it, but if as long as you checked it, you like lifted the scar tissue and there's no actual perforation, it is still considered kosher. The term glat, which means smooth, is specifically referring to that. They will feel the lungs. What they do is they blow up the lungs, they put it in water to see if there's any leak. And if there isn't a leak, they check it just to make sure it's all smooth. Then if it does have scar tissue, but the scar tissue is not connected to an actual perforation, that's called not glat meat. It's preferable to eat glat meat, but Ashkenazim will eat meat that's not glat. Sephardim will not. Okay. And one who slaughters it with a fit slaughter and eats of its meat, we're talking about an animal that had one of those other conditions. That is what we call a treifa. So if you shechted it and then you ate it, you get lashes for eating it. The conditions that render it torn have already been explained in the Gemara and Chulin, pages 42 to 58. Elu Trephos is the name of that chapter. That chapter, whenever we get to it in Daf Yomi, there's an actual, there was a book with great pictures for the last time that we went through it. But by now, I'm sure we're just going to make reference to stuff that's on the internet because it's probably there are probably much better pictures by now available on the internet. But it used to be about pictures. And when I was getting my smicha, they didn't even have, like, now the books they have now are like glossy pictures of the various conditions. The ones I was looking at, they were like renderings, and they were not that clear. One of my teachers, Rabbi Meltzer, he should live long and in good health, Rabbi Shmariel Meltzer, he mentioned that after he got his smicha, he's from Minneapolis, after he got his smicha, and his father was a butcher in Minneapolis. So after he got his smicha, one day his father came home from work, and he had like a brown paper wrapper, put it on the table and opened it up, and there was a slab of meat inside of it, and he goes, "Kosher or treif?" to his son. And Rabbi Meltzer said, "I had no idea what that meat was." Here he had gotten smicha, which included treifus, but he couldn't identify the actual cut of meat, where it was from. And this is the sort of irony, I guess it's true in medical school as well, that when you first are taking your tests, it's all theoretical, and it's all what you imagine in your mind. Everything that you're studying, all the symptoms, all the indications are very clear, and it's very obvious what kind of meat it is. And then in the real world, you just see all those organs look alike practically. And it ends up, it was the stomach, the kurkabon in Aramaic, the heilige kurkabon, the holy kurkabon, the holy stomach. That's what he used to call it. Okay. And the regulations of this commandment and the ones before it have been explained at the end of Tractate Makot. Now, an animal that is a treifa is, once it becomes a treifa, the milk of that animal is forbidden. Let's say it's a cow or a sheep or a goat. The milk of that animal is forbidden. Let's say it's a bird. Then the eggs from that animal are forbidden. So even though you have eggs, chicken eggs, and regularly chicken eggs are kosher, but if you know that there is a problem with that chicken and it is a treifa, then those eggs are not kosher. So there's a possibility, and we talked about this not too long ago, there's a possibility that milk or chicken or eggs might not be kosher. You don't have to assume that, but if you know it, you're not allowed to eat it. There was a period of time where they were commonly giving injections to chickens, and apparently there were enough of those injections that were actually rendered chickens a treifa, that they were concerned, and there started to be a hechsher for eggs. And now you still will see it on some, I think Eggland's Best, several of the egg companies have a hechsher on them. And that's the reason for the hechsher, is to let you know that they are not from a chicken that was a treifa. And it's the same thing with milk. If you look on milk cartons, there are many milk cartons that have a hechsher on it. That hechsher does not mean that it's cholav Yisrael, milk that was milked by a Jew. It just means that the cows that this milk is coming from did not have surgery that would render them a treifa. Apparently, there is a surgery that is not tremendously uncommon, that renders a cow a treifa, and therefore its milk would be no good. And like my son AY, over the years has supervised the various stages of cheese production, and there were certain farms he would go to where there was milking done, and it was one of his jobs to make sure that the cows that had that surgery were separated from the rest of the cows that were being milked. So that is all a byproduct of the treifa condition. So it's not just the meat of the treifa that's forbidden, but any product that comes from it. He prohibited us from eating a limb from a living animal, and that is that one cuts a limb from it while it's still alive and eats a kazais of that limb in its natural, complete form, even if there was only the smallest amount of meat to it. And one who eats it is lashed. The prohibition about it is his saying, and you must not eat the life with the meat. The language of the Sifrei is the life with the meat. And so the actual Hebrew from that is Lo tochal hanefesh im habasar. Hanefesh im habasar ze ever min achai. So when it says the life with the meat, it's talking about meat from a living animal. Likewise, it is explained in the Gemara Chulin, and there it is said, if one ate a limb from a living animal and meat from a living animal, he's liable twice. The explanation of this is that there are two different prohibitions. One prohibition is you must not eat the life, which is the prohibition of the limb. And the second prohibition is you must not eat meat that was torn in the field. So previously, we had this prohibition, which is the just eating the meat from a living animal. But this is a separate prohibition, which is the limb. Obviously, you're still eating meat, but it's from a limb. You now have a limb of the living animal. And so you could technically violate two prohibitions, as we explained in the previous commandment. The prohibition about this content was already repeated with different language when he said to Noach about to live from a living animal, yet flesh with its lifeblood you shall not eat. Now, you might think that this is just referring to the blood itself, that you shouldn't eat meat with blood. He's telling you that that's not just that's actually extended to another case, which is the case of meat or the limb of a living animal. He prohibited us from eating the sciatic nerve, what's called the Gid Hanosha. And that is his saying, therefore the children of Israel do not eat the sciatic nerve. One who ate all of it, even if it was very small. So if you ate the entire sciatic nerve, even though it's less than a kazais, or he ate a kazais of it without being the whole thing, is lashed. The regulations of this commandment have already been explained in the chapter 7 of Chulin. Now, what's interesting here is the Rambam has made this point in other places that we are not actually commanded to fulfill a mitzvah, if it was commanded to the patriarchs, that alone would not make us responsible or prohibited. It has to have been mentioned at Sinai or going forward. And when I say Sinai or going forward, that includes leaving Egypt. So from Egypt, from the leaving Egypt onwards, that's where our mitzvahs come from. They don't come from the book of Bereshis. So then why is he mentioning the book of Bereshis here as the source? That quote is from Bereshis. So this makes you wonder why. Why is he quoting that source? So let's just see here. Problem is the way they design this Rambam. Here it is. Mishnah Torah, Forbidden Foods. All right, let's go. Let's look here. All right. So this is from the codes. When a person partakes of an olive-sized portion of blood intentionally, he's liable for karet. If he does so inadvertently, he is liable to bring a fixed sin offering. It is explicitly stated in the Torah that he is liable for partaking of blood from all domesticated animals, wild beasts, and fowl alone. This applies whether they are from a non-kosher or a kosher species. As it states in Vayikra, you may not partake of any blood from a fowl or animal in all your dwellings. A wild beast is considered as an animal. As it states, there are animals that you may eat, an ox or a gazelle or a deer. One is not, by contrast, liable for the transgression of prohibition against partaking of blood, for partaking of the blood of fish, locusts, creeping animals, teeming animals, or humans. You see here, human blood is not forbidden by that prohibition. Therefore, it is permitted to partake of the blood of kosher fish and locusts, even if one collects it in a container and drinks it. It's permitted. The blood of non-kosher fish and locusts is forbidden because it comes from the bodies like milk of a non-kosher animal. The blood of creeping animals is comparable to their bodies, as we explained. The blood of a human is forbidden according to rabbinic law if it departed from the person's body. So one is liable for stripes for rebellious conduct. It's not biblically forbidden, but it is rabbinically forbidden. When by contest one's teeth bleed, you can swallow that, and he doesn't have to hold himself back because it didn't come out yet, as long as it's in your mouth. If one bit into bread and found blood on it, therefore you have to scrape away the blood before partaking of it, for the blood has now departed the body. So this is a lot of blood stuff. One is liable for koros only for blood that flows out from an animal when it was slaughtered. In other words, the first blood that comes out when it's slaughtered, killed, or decapitated, as long as the tinted red blood that is collected within the heart. Blood that is the blood that flows forcibly from the body, one is not, however, liable for blood that drips at the beginning of bloodletting before it begins to flow forcefully, or blood that drips at the end of bloodletting when the bleeding begins to cease. So if you did bloodletting on an animal, in Tanzania, the Maasai, I think they tap the blood of certain animals and then add it to drink. So that it depends. If you get it, if the blood is like forcefully coming out, that's korate level blood. But if it's not, not that first forceful part, then it so if it's before it's forcefully pushing out or afterwards, then it's biblically forbidden, but it's not koros. It is like blood within the limbs. In other words, regular blood in the meat. That blood in the meat that we salt the meat for, that is forbidden. It's biblically forbidden, but it's not a korate level punishment. The koros level punishment for blood is if you're taking the blood right after the slaughter that just pours out. That's the blood that you would sprinkle on the altar if it was a korban. You can't drink that blood. That would be a koros level penalty. One is not liable for koros for concentrated blood or the blood within the limbs, the blood of the spleen, the kidneys, the testicles, the blood that collects in the heart at the time the animal is slaughtered, and the blood found in the liver. A person who partakes of an olive-sized portion of, however, is liable for lashes. Still biblically forbidden, but it's not a koros level penalty. As it is written, you may not partake of any blood. With regard to one's liability for korate, it states, for the soul of the flesh is in the blood. Implied is that one is only liable for koros for blood that causes the soul to expire. All right, now it goes through the heart, the liver, the spleen, salting. Right. How to salt the head, birds, intestines, a knife if you used If you shet at a non-kosher animal, what happens to the knife? A plate that you salted on. When meat has been salted in a bowl, one is forbidden to eat hot food in it for all time, for the blood has already been absorbed in the clay. Okay, that came up the other day in another class. But it doesn't, for some reason, and it talks about the forbidden fats. Where is? There it is. The prohibition against partaking of the gid hanasha applies with regard to kosher domesticated animals and wild beasts, even a velot or treifot. It applies to a fetus and to animals that have been consecrated, both those consecrated for sacrifice of which we partake and for sacrifice of which we do not partake. It applies to the gid on the right thigh and that on the left thigh. According to scriptural law, only the gid on the hip socket is forbidden, which is on the hip socket. The remainder of the gid, which is above the socket or below the socket. Similarly, the fat, which is on the gid, which is again the sciatic nerve, are forbidden only according to rabbinic decree. There are two giddim. The inner one next to the bone is forbidden according to scriptural law. The outer one is forbidden by rabbinic law. When a person partakes of the inner gid anosha on the socket, he's liable for lashes. If he partakes of the fat of the gid, the remainder of the inner gid or the entire outer one is liable for stripes for rebellious conduct. What is the measure of which one must partake to be liable? An olive-sized portion. If one ate the entire gid on the socket, then even if it's less than an olive size, you're liable. It's because it's a berry, it's considered an entire entity. The prohibition against gid anasha does not apply with regard to fowl because it does not have a hip socket. Instead, its thigh is long and flat. If there is a fowl whose thigh is shaped like that of the thigh of an animal, it has a hip socket, its gid hanasha is forbidden, but one is not liable for lashes because of it. Similarly, when there is an animal whose thigh is long enough, who's long like that of a fowl, its gid hanasha is forbidden, but you're not liable for lashes. And I'm not sure what kind of birds or animals would be included in those cases. When a person partakes of gid hanasha, all right, freifa. One who removes the gid hanasha must ferret out all traces of it until nothing remains. A butcher's word is accepted with regard to gid hanasha, just as it is with regard to forbidden fat. Accordingly, we do not purchase meat from every butcher, only from an upright man who has established a reputation for observance. If he slaughters meat himself and sells it, his word is accepted. Where does this apply? In the diaspora. In Eretz Yisrael, by contrast, when it is populated entirely by Torah observant Jews, meat may be purchased from anyone. Okay. So so again, you're allowed to remove the gid hanosha, and then the meat would be permitted. But nowadays, in America, apparently, we don't have people who are expert in the removing of the gid hanosha, so we just don't eat that whole portion of the animal, and they tend to sell it to people who eat not kosher meat. In Israel, apparently, there are more people that are expert in removing that, and therefore, in Israel, it's more common to find those cuts of meat from the rear, like the filet mignon, etc. There are some restaurants in New York that have meat that had nikur done to it, and maybe tomorrow we'll just look at that subject. Why is it that our shoftim don't know how to do it or do know how to do it. And maybe we'll look at that tomorrow. I'm very grateful that we got a chance to learn together today. And I look forward to learning with you guys tomorrow.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Be well, guys.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're
Bye-bye.
welcome. You're welcome. Bye-bye.